Good morning. Our reading for today is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 19 through 33. And in most Bibles, actually, chapter 11, verse 1 is grouped with chapter 10. But whichever. So I'll probably read it today and tomorrow. But in chapter 8, Paul talked a lot about food offered to idols and yesterday we were looking at the first part of chapter 10 and that was reminding us that we should learn from history. And I saw a post last night as well, an article that was talking about how we need to pay attention to history so that we don't repeat ourselves, and that is so true. And we'll just leave that as, history is there for our benefit. And he concludes that conversation about knowing history in these first couple of verses we look at today. And again, he's talking here again about food offered to idols and eating that food offered to idols. And he says, in verse 19, what do I imply? That food sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. It's just that what pagans offer sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And then he says, I don't want you to be partners with demons. And he goes on, in the rest of this chapter, talking about how this food offered to demons, isn't really going to hurt us because, of course, there is no demon. The idols. There is no God. There is no other thing that way. But demons, Satan definitely works through those idols. And he says in verse 21, the end of it, you cannot partake in the table of the Lord and the table of the demons. You can't worship God and Satan. You can't partake of both. You can't. Jesus says you can only serve one master, and we need to, who is our master? Who will we follow? Who will we believe? And he asks the question, are we provoking the Lord to jealousy? God says, I am a jealous God. You shall have no other gods before me. And so when we, anytime we sin, anytime we hear and listen to Satan, that's not what God would have. And God says, why can't you just believe and trust? But he knows that we have this human weakness. And goes on from that. And then in verse 23 again, we hear the same that we heard a couple other times. All things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. And this was a phrase that was used to basically just say, anything goes. We can do whatever we want. But Paul is reminding them, you can't do anything and everything you want. It's not that we sin more so that God can have more grace. We are to try to change and to conform to what God would have us living and doing. He says, do not seek your own advantage, but that of the other. Don't just be self-seeking. Don't put yourself above others, but, consider others. And especially in this food offered to idols, and if you go someplace and they serve something, eat it. But if they make a big issue out of it that this has been offered to idols, well, then maybe you shouldn't eat it, so that you don't do something that would hinder someone else's belief, or that someone would look at you and say, well, he's doing that, so I could certainly do it. And we hear that today in our today's society. Well, so and so does that, so why can't I do that? Well, just because so and so does it make it correct? Does it make it that God would have us do? No, not necessarily. In verse 25, he gives good advice, I think. He says, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising questions on the ground of conscience. He says, The earth and its fullness are the Lord's. And then in verse 27 is if an unbeliever invites you to a meal, and you are, you go, you'll eat whatever is set before you without raising questions on grounds of conscience. So you don't have to worry that, if this meal that this unbeliever is serving contains something that was offered to an idol. I mean, that's not a condemning factor for you. You don't have to worry about it. Don't let your conscience sit in there and say, well, man, do I dare to do? I dare, but eat what is offered that way. But then he says, if someone has said to you, well, this was offered in sacrifice, well, then maybe you shouldn't eat it, he says, do not eat it, very emphatic, do not, so that you will, out of consideration for the one who informed you and consideration of conscience. And it's again that be aware of others, and so that others will not imitate you in doing something that might lead them astray. And he says, do this for the sake of conscience, the other's conscience, not your own. I mean, I know that whatever I eat doesn't condemn me, and whatever I don't eat doesn't condemn me. But in these early days of Christianity, that with so much food being offered to idols and everything going on that way, and often that food that was or different, not only food, but other items that were sacrificed to idols would find their way to the marketplace. And so people would unwittingly be buying some of this sacrificial food. But if they didn't know it was sacrificial food, Paul is saying it's not going to have any ill effect on you. It's just going to be fine. He says, if I partake with thankfulness, why should I be denounced of that for which I give thanks? And so if I join these unbelievers for dinner and I eat with them and we have a good time and we had good company, why should I feel guilty about being with them? And it's another one of those things too that it shows openness, it shows acceptance. And by doing so, he's also witnessing his faith and his trust in God as well. And kind of sums up here in verse 31, he says, so whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do for the glory of God. And so it's, don't make it about you. And it's don't make a big show of it, and don't make an issue out of it. But whatever you do, whether you eat it or whether you don't, just do it for the glory of God. And you could quietly say something, but don't make a big issue out of it that way. He says, give no offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. And then he says, just as I try to please everybody. We know that we can't be people pleasers. We cannot make everybody happy. But Paul is saying, I don't want to do anything that's going to be a stumbling block for someone else. And he says, I do not seek my own advantage, but that of many, so that they may be saved. So he's very conscious of his eating habits, of all of his habits, and he's conscious that people are watching him. And it's just a reminder that what we do can have an impact on others. And it reminds me of a youth trip we were on many years ago, and we were looking for a place to have a Bible study in this park, and there were a lot of different people, different places in the park, and we found a spot. We thought we weren't going to bother anybody or infringe upon them, and we had our Bible study. And later, one of the men that was sitting nearby talked to one of the youth, and he says, those Bible verses, he says that's good stuff. He says that made an impact on them. So even when you're trying to be inconspicuous about your faith and what you're doing, people pay attention. And especially they pay attention to see if you are doing what God would have you do, if you're faithful in your actions that way. The last thing that is in this paragraph is chapter 11, verse 1, but be imitators of Christ. remember that he would do his best to be welcoming and open and honest and not to do anything that would cause someone else to stumble in faith.